TV International.
Egypt has put Africa as a first priority file in its work, in representing its causes, and in representing it in all forums. Egypt has prioritized the construction and the development to support the peace and security inside the continent, and that was very much reflected during its chairmanship to the African Union and the African Union Security Council. Definitely one of our main and most important partners is the African Development Bank. And today we have all the honor of having with us the President of the Africa Development Bank, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina. Thank you so much for being with us.
Shukran, thank you.
Welcome to Egypt, and as we understood that you've been meeting with the President this morning. Yes. So let me know more about the agenda of the talks. How did it go, and ways that you discussed in collaboration?
Well, thank you very much. I'm always delighted to be in Egypt. You know, the last time I was here was in Sharm el-Sheikh during the COP27 meeting, which was an incredible success to see. So always a delight to be back to see the President El-Sisi. I was telling him today that I came to see him in 3 capacities. First, you know, I consider him to be a big brother for myself. You know, and so the second one, of course, is that he is a leader that I highly admire because of his vision, his tenacity, his ability to run things at scale that works, and I'm like that too. Of course, thirdly, as president of the African Development Bank, because we are hosting, we're actually going to be having you host us in Egypt for the Sharm el-Sheikh for the annual meetings of the African Development Bank. Well, the discussions with the president first was to thank him for the government of Egypt's acceptance to host this meeting, the annual meetings of the African Development Bank. Our annual meetings are a big deal. You know, we have people come from around the world. We've got thousands of people that come. We've got ministers and governors of the bank from across the world. We have 81 countries that are members of the African Development Bank. Of course, Egypt, a very important strategic partner and an investor in the African Development Bank. We have heads of state that will be coming, several heads of state that will be coming as well. So it was an opportunity for me to come to speak with His Excellency President El-Sisi, thank him personally for the efforts of the government to host this very important meeting, but also at the same time to ask for his continued support for the issues in Africa. About, you know, he always has been a leader that's focused on issues of regional integration. He showed that leadership again at a global level when he chaired the COP27, which was all about climate change and green growth. And of course, the agenda of the African Development Bank's annual meeting, it's about how we mobilize financing, private sector financing for climate and of course for green growth. So I'm in the right place with the right leader, the right country. So of course I'm excited to be here.
Indeed. You've been speaking about several points that were raised and were always raised during several meetings and summits that took place, starting with the Africa Summit that took place in 2018, that is even before Egypt assumed the presidency of the African Union. But let me here ask, there are many challenges, particularly at this very juncture of the history. We're seeing lots of challenges facing Africa, not because Africa is the reason, but because Africa is paying the price. One of them is, of course, the supply chain or the Ukraine-Russia war. And definitely the African Bank has its own vision regarding such a challenge. What's the vision?
Well, first and foremost is that the world is in a lot of chaos right now because of the war, Russia's war in Ukraine. And you've seen the impacts of that on Africa. First, in terms of high energy prices, you've seen it in the very high prices of wheat, of maize, of oil seeds, which are very high around the world. You've seen it in a very high rate in terms of the shipping costs, which has actually led to high inflation all around the world, and which also affects Egypt significantly because you import quite a lot of wheat, oilseed and maize also from both Russia and also from Ukraine. We've also seen it in the very high prices of fertilizers from around the world because, in particular in Africa, because the countries couldn't get access to the fertilizers. And so my own approach always to anything development is a default approach and look at what you can do domestically. Okay, so immediately we saw these problems coming out of Ukraine and the impacts in terms of the prices, especially in terms of price of food, which was going to put Africa at a risk of food insecurity. The African Development Bank moved very, very speedily. We set up an Africa Emergency Food Production Facility of $1.5 billion, which is, we ran this in about 2 months. We were done with approving it. It was one of the fastest operations we've ever done. So I showed that we're actually quite responsive to that. And this facility is now supporting more than 34 countries to produce 38 million metric tons of food. That will be wheat, it will be rice, it will be oilseeds, it will be soybeans and all of that. And that will be valued at $12 billion. And so that's how quick we are in responding to that. But I do realize that that is just an immediate response. But how do you deal with the structural issues of how Africa actually needs to feed itself on a longer term basis? And we as the bank, we have what we call Feed Africa strategy to make Africa completely self-sufficient in producing food.
And what is this strategy exactly?
This strategy is basically to say, look, Africa today has 65% of all the arable land uncultivated in the world. And so to feed the world, you don't need, it's not about, the future of feeding the world is not in Europe, it's not in Latin America, it's not in Asia, it's in Africa. So what Africa does with that agriculture becomes the future of the world. So what we're doing at the African Development Bank, we launched what's called a Feed Africa strategy. And that strategy is to make sure that farmers in Africa have the best performing technologies, they have the right support of infrastructure, they have right policies and financing to double, triple production of food and be able to feed themselves. So I was delighted in January this year to have co-hosted the Feed Africa Summit in Dakar with President Macky Sall, who was at the time the chairman of the African Union. And it attracted 34 heads of state and government, physically present at the meeting. And what we were able to do, we put together a plan for Africa to achieve full self-sufficiency in 3 years. And in 5 years to be able to become a major player in terms of export of food around the world. And we've, as of last week, we had mobilized more than $54 billion towards that particular effort. And there is a particular, some donors that are coming on board, and we may be able to get to $70 billion very soon. So all of that just to say that Africa must decouple itself from all these impacts of what is happening from the war of Russia in Ukraine, and being able to produce food, sell food among itself, and make sure it thrives rather than being susceptible as vulnerable.
Efforts to mobilize finances, particularly in areas of importance or of priority in Africa. We're speaking here about construction, we're speaking about development, we're speaking about very important files that Africa has to deal with. What's the bank's vision towards such priorities regarding this upcoming future?
Well, first and foremost, the biggest challenge that Africa faces is infrastructure. I was talking today with President al-Sisi. We were talking about this particular issue. Africa needs to have electricity. You have a continent in which 600 million people do not have access to electricity. Okay. At the African Development Bank, over the last 7 years, we have helped to connect more than 20 million people to electricity, but there's still a long way to go. And so we were actually investing about $25 billion over 10 years in helping Africa to do that for electricity. Other challenges, of course, that you have to deal with, has to do with digital infrastructure. We live in a world in which everything is digital, so you need to have digital infrastructure. The bank is investing heavily in digital infrastructure, submarine fiber optic cables, whether it's in East Africa, whether it's in the in Mali, Chad, all the way to the Mediterranean, or in Central Africa, to make sure we can reduce the cost of access to internet, so you can have greater amount of financial inclusion. It's a big part of what we do. The other issue that we have to do is you need ports, you need rail, you need airports, and we are investing heavily in this. So as African Development Bank, we're helping to close the infrastructure gap in Africa. In the last 7 years, we have invested well over $44 billion just on infrastructure. And I'll give you an example. Some of the critical infrastructure, for example, take Egypt. In Egypt, we've invested in the water and sanitation infrastructure here. I'm most proud of what we've done with the Gamal Al Asaf water treatment plant here, which is providing treatment of sewage water to be able to do irrigation for more than 12 million people. We also have Abu Sawad water project here. That's again another project that is looking at water treatment. So both water and sanitation are very, very important. The Abu Rawash, I think, Abu Rawash is the name of the project, to be able to provide that. So infrastructure continues to be an area that we're investing heavily in. And we just launched an initiative called Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa, which is trying to green the entire infrastructure space in Africa, to bring in $10 billion to have green hydrogen, for example, to be able to green the entire transport infrastructure, to be able to also have electric batteries that can actually run cars and therefore decarbonize our economy. So we continue to invest massively on infrastructure. That infrastructure is very important, in particular, to have the Africa Continental Free Trade Area work. So infrastructure is like the backbone in your body. If you have it, you can sit up straight. If you don't, you can't. Infrastructure is vital, and we are taking it very seriously.
As Egypt assumed this year at the steering committee of the NEPAD, and of course there is the African Free Trade Area Agreement, and definitely as one of the collaborators with Egypt and definitely the African continent at large, how do you view how to activate such agreements in order to serve the higher priorities for Africa?
Well, first is, trading requires three things. First, you must have what you can trade in. So supporting increased productivity in critical sectors. I mentioned agriculture. Pharmaceutical products is another one. Automobile is another one. And several other sectors, oil, mineral, gas, and things like that. And so we are supporting critical sectors like that to be able to raise the productivity, and therefore you can trade things to trade with. Secondly, it's being able to have the infrastructure for trading. So you got to be able to connect countries to themselves with ports, with rail, with digital infrastructure, and these are very, very important. So we are investing in those critical connectivity infrastructure. For example, transmitting power between one region where you have supply surplus to another area where you have deficit supply. So you have to be able to integrate your energy markets as one. The third part of trading is you need to be able to have financial payment systems that can allow you to trade. And so we ourselves, Afri-Exim Bank, for example, which is our partner also, making sure we can have digital payment systems that allow you to be able to trade. And finally is being able to make sure that trade is not just a question of big companies alone trading. Most of the traders you've had in Africa are small and medium-sized enterprises, making sure they have access to financing to be able to trade. And by the way, most of the traders are women. We want to make sure that the free trade zone is one that they can trade without harassment, without any sexual harassment, and making sure that those that do not have education, what we call fundamental education, English or French or whatever, or Arabic, well, doesn't mean that you are illiterate just because you can't speak those languages. We have to make sure that we can take those in the informal sector and make sure they can also participate in the more formal sector by reducing the barriers to trade for a lot of the people that are in that informal sector.
So we're speaking here about empowering women and empowering youth, startups and entrepreneurs, right?
Well, that is a key part of it. Let me give you two examples for the women. Women run Africa, just so you know. The business in Africa are run by women. At the African Development Bank, we set up a program that's called the Affirmative Finance Action for Women in Africa. AFAWA is the name, which is to mobilize $5 billion for women businesses in Africa. And in the last 1 year alone, we have actually, as the African Development Bank, paid out to businesses run by women $1 billion US, just to tell you. And our goal is to be able to reach $5 billion for businesses run by women. But the other thing you raised was the issue of the youth. Today, for example, I was just in my discussion with Mr. Abdallah, the central bank governor here. We were talking about that. He let me know that you have 1 million young people that enter the labor market every year and they need jobs. I was talking to His Excellency President El-Sisi about that. And that is why today in Africa, you have a third of Africa's youth unemployed, a third of them underemployed, and a third of them simply angry with government. And therefore, what we have to do is to make sure we have a financial ecosystem that can support their ideas, that can incubate their ideas, that can give them the resources they need to create youth-based wealth. You know, I don't believe, for example, that the future of Africa's youth lies in Europe. It doesn't lie in the United States. It doesn't lie in Asia or Latin America. It lies in Africa, growing well, able to support good skills, jobs, entrepreneurship that will allow our young people to have a decent quality of life. And that's why at the African Development Bank, we are now rolling out what is called Youth Entrepreneurship Investment Banks. These are going to be new financial institutions that will support the businesses of young people. You know, if a young person, you walk into a commercial bank, what do they see? Well, they see nothing but risk, right? But you may have great ideas, great creativity, but somebody has to believe in your idea and be able to put finance behind it. No, we believe in Africa's youth, and we are going to put our capital at risk on their behalf, and that is a risk worth taking.
So today you've been, as you said, respectively meeting with the president, and you have discussed the bank's annual meeting, this upcoming meeting, which will be hosted at the Red Sea Resort of Sharm el-Sheikh. And what are we supposed to be expecting from this upcoming meeting, and how far will it help Africa at large to fulfill its aspirations?
No, it's a very good question. You know, if you take a look today, what do we have? You know, all across Africa, you have a lot of drought. You have a lot of cyclones, you see what has happened in Mozambique, see what happened in Malawi, see what happened in Madagascar. You have devastation from climate change everywhere. So on top of COVID, we had a debt crisis that's also triggered because of the climate change, because the damaged infrastructure has to be repaired. And therefore, we must make sure that Africa gets the resources it needs to adapt to climate change. Today, Africa loses between $7 billion to $15 billion a year because of climate change. And if we don't do anything, by 2030, that is going to rise to $50 billion every year because of climate change. And so, but to be able to adapt to it, Africa didn't cause climate change. We only contributed to no more than 3% of historical emissions, you know. But we need at least, you know, $1.4 trillion by 2030 to be able to adapt to that climate change. And so issue is, where do you get those resources from? Some of it, of course, has to come from the public sector. The governments, the developed countries who cause most of these problems have committed themselves to $100 billion a year payment, which is a token as far as I am concerned, but it's a very important token. And I want to thank President El-Sisi and the government of Egypt for having put that on the agenda of COP27, that it is there. We also had on the agenda the loss and damage pushed for by the government. President El-Sisi was also approved by COP27. However, we do need to have resources from the private sector. You know, private sector is very, very important. There's a lot of capital that is sitting out there with pension funds, with sovereign wealth funds, that these institutional investors should be putting into green infrastructure, for example, energy, water, sanitation, road, rail, ports, and so on. So what we are going to do with the annual meeting of the African Development Bank is look at what are the ways in which we can leverage private sector financing to deal with green growth and also to deal with climate change. What are some of the risks that they face? What are the ways in which we can develop bankable projects that private sector can actually put money into, and what should we do in terms of regulations that create incentives for private sector to invest in green, actually. Because today in Africa, for example, we only have 0.2% of global green bonds being in Africa. So how do we encourage most of those to come into Africa? So that's what the annual meeting of the African Development Bank is going to be thinking about. How do we mobilize these trillions of dollars that we need? And how do we get smart from the public side to be able to leverage that? So I'm looking forward to it, and that's what we're going to be having a conversation about.
What was the outcome of your meetings, particularly with the president, and particularly of what concerns this upcoming meeting?
Well, first and foremost, the president, I want to thank President El-Sisi for accepting to host the meeting. He gave me the full assurance that this was going to be probably our best annual meeting ever. Egypt has actually hosted the annual meetings of the bank in the past. You hosted it in 1987. You hosted it in 1999. And President El-Sisi said it's going to be a fantastic time this year that we are hosting it. Second, I think the facilities that you have ready, I was assured, are fantastic. We saw it during COP27. I'm traveling to Sharm el-Sheikh tomorrow to go and meet with the governor of the South Sinai there to go and physically see those facilities. His Excellency President El-Sisi has also invited several heads of state to come to this particular meeting. It shows a great political support that is given to this particular effort. And I think that the other issue that we discussed, Mr. President, that I think is very critical for the annual meeting, is he emphasized, and he always does this time and time again, the importance of investing more and more on infrastructure. And in this particular case, I would add, climate resilient infrastructure in the face of climate change. So we will need President El-Sisi's leadership, his commitment, and his support for us to have an excellent annual meetings, as he has promised that we will do. I always believe everything he tells me because he always delivers them.
Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, the President of the African Development Bank, we thank you so much for being with us and for your input, and definitely it was a real pleasure having you on Nile TV.
Thank you so very much. It's good to be here.
Welcome back. President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi received on Tuesday the credentials of a number of ambassadors accredited to Egypt. The credentials included the ambassadors of Ireland, Sultanate of Brunei,